On today's podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Srishti Hukku. Srishti is a Kashmiri Canadian and the youngest and first racialized accredited humanist chaplain in Canada, and was part of the leadership team that professionalized humanist chaplaincy across the country. Srishti is a lifetime member of Humanist Canada, a humanist officiant and supporter of the AHA, Humanists UK, Humanist Australia, and Humanists International. Srishti holds a master's in public administration and is completing a PhD in population health and medical anthropology. In today's episode, Srishti and I have a challenging conversation about sexism and misogyny, both in society at large and within the humanist movement itself. We talk about how it manifests, some of her personal experiences with it, and what we can do to combat it. I bring you my conversation with Srishti Hukku. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. So, Srishti Hukku, thank you for taking the time and speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Leslie, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I want to talk about an important but also sensitive topic, and it's not something that I can claim any real expertise in because it's not something that I am really capable of experiencing. The topic is misogyny in humanism. Now, we have both been involved in secular humanist circles in Canada for some time, but as you can see, I'm a guy, so misogyny does not directly affect me the way it would someone like you who has also been involved, but are not a guy. So I was hoping that you could essentially introduce yourself to our audience and sort of broach the topic of what it's like being a prominent woman in engaging in humanist activism in Canada.
That's a tall order, Leslie, but I'm going to give it a
go.
So
one step at a time, bit by bit.
So, very briefly, I've been involved in humanism for the better part of 2 decades, and I think it is a beautiful way of giving folks meaning in terms of how they live, a strong ethical framework, and it has some really strong pillars around compassion, shared human values, human dignity, and it's been influential throughout the world in terms of things like the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. So I think it is really a powerful force for good around the world. As with all things built by humans, it is far from perfect. And unfortunately, the practice of humanism, sometimes in the organized fashion, I think can be marked, like all institutions, with misogyny. So, misogyny, for those listeners who aren't well versed, can be defined in many different ways, but the common thread in the idea of misogyny is that there is a hatred towards women that is fueled by a whole host of reasons, patriarchy possibly being one of them. So I hope that sort of lays the landscape a little bit, Leslie.
Sure. One of the things that I was thinking about before coming to this conversation was that we've grown up in a male-dominated society that we've inherited right from ancient times. If we look at the major religious traditions, they definitely have explicit male preferences. Like in Judaism, women are segregated in worship in the Orthodox circles. In Christianity, there's
Right.
roles, the priests that are open
Everything
only
to do with Eve.
yeah, right. Having a only open to men in Islam. There's different sets of rules that apply to women. I believe I should probably look this up, but I think I remember reading that according to strict Islamic law, that a woman's testimony is worth half that as a man, and so we've all evolved. Our societies have evolved with these mindsets, and it's explicit in like the founding philosophies, even if there are strains of Islam and Judaism and Christianity that have broken away from that. It's still part of like the founding philosophy of those doctrines.
And
Uh,
I think it's important to note here that it is not unfortunately limited to Western or Abrahamic religion. So you find similar tenets in other Eastern philosophies as well. I'm not an expert
mhm.
in terms of religiosity. I'm more of an expert in irreligiosity. So I won't kind of define exactly, but my lived experience certainly suggests that there are embedded beliefs around things like menstruation, abortion, bodily autonomy, sexual and reproductive health that are inherently flawed in worldviews, not just the ones that you've listed. I think it's
Right.
important that, to really identify this as a global phenomenon. And, from my perspective, perhaps an epidemic that we haven't dealt with. And I think as someone who is an aspiring anthropological scholar, there is a lot of really great literature out there on kind of showing how it's not limited, unfortunately, to one time or one place. There is a vast history of misogyny.
Okay, that's great because I'm not. I mean, I was born and raised in Canada. I am most familiar with the Abrahamic faiths. I've done some reading on the others, but my familiarity is much lower. So, but I'm I'm happy. That's the wrong term, but certainly willing to extend that thesis more broadly. The question that I have is that. Yeah, I've grown up in again. I grew up here in
Mhm,
Canada. I think that we've made some progress in the last couple centuries, and especially in the last few decades, in terms of uh, changing our views of women. But it's like in the air that we breathe. It's sort of embedded in a lot of societal structures. Humanism, from my perspective, and I want to, and the reason this is a question is because I want to know if I'm correct or not.
mhm.
Humanism does not have, as part of its founding philosophy or as part of its basic tenets, misogynistic principles, but there's no inherent conflict. I could be a humanist and still think men are better than women. It may not be philosophically coherent, but I certain could be. Okay, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. And I think people are equal, but men are just better suited to certain things than women are, and we the term that I've heard used most recently is that I'm just a realist. Like I wish it wasn't the case, but I mean, the facts are men are taller on average than women. They are stronger on average uh, than women. These are just biological facts. It may be regrettable, and then we can, and then the bridge to some other thing. This thing that I think is really good. We men just happen to be better at geometry or analytical thinking or problem solving or rational thought, and
Or being in leadership
or
positions.
being in men are just natural leaders, and women, I mean, there are some that are good, but they're the rare exception.
Right.
And I don't, I wish it weren't so, but I'm a realist. The term realist or realism is the one that I've heard quite a bit. So I acknowledge that there's like that possibility, but I don't have a sense of A, whether it's embedded in humanism, or B, how common it is. And perhaps you can share your experiences and your insights on within humanism, what it's like to be a woman, and your experiences with sexism and misogyny.
So I think this is a really important question, Leslie, because I think it really depends on how you define inherent in humanism, right? So we have contemporary humanist thought, and we have a lot of debate within humanism now, as I think we try and consider intersectionality, which is kind of recognizing that people have a variety of lived experiences, a variety of privileges and points of oppression in their lives, a variety of identifiers. So, for example, I'm a first generation immigrant, I'm female bodied, I do and have been educated primarily in the West. These are, on balance, things that are privileges and disadvantages. And I think the lens of intersectionality really helps us to consider these things. And then, secondly, I think when you look at the the stories around where humanism starts, I would say historically we have attributed humanism purely to the Renaissance and uh, as a purely Western thought tradition. But myself and others continue to challenge that notion. I think as long as there have been folks that look for supernatural explanations, there have been folks like us on the other side who are looking for kind of scientifically tested and ever evolving ways to explain quote unquote reality, coming back to that word. So I think these are important kind of foundational pieces to look at in order to explain why I'm going to say that perhaps the stories around humanism that we have built up are inherently problematic. So, in terms of the origin story of humanism, I think there is a problematique there in terms of how we characterize who are humanist thought leaders. They seem to only look a certain way. They seem to only embody, um, have a certain embodiment. So generally male. Um, and so I think these are important things to challenge in terms of who was at the table when we wrote those sort of quote unquote founding documents of humanism, who was at the table when we wrote the minimum statement, who was at the table when we were having international discussions on governance. And I think although there is not necessarily an intent to exclude, I think humanism has been historically and unfortunately continues today to be exclusive in many ways. And those rooms are not always the most welcoming to people who look or sound like me, unfortunately. So, sorry,
I,
go ahead.
no, well, I want you to get into that a little bit more.
Sure.
So that last statement you just said, that the rooms in which these conversations are happening. So
Yeah.
I'm going to make explicit what you just alluded to. And I think it's fair to say that if you look back over the last, say, 25 years, when you look at the four horsemen of atheism, and you
Mm-hmm.
look at the humanist movement more generally, uh, uh, the majority of folks, the vast majority of folks in the leadership positions that have been the spokespeople for the movement, have been white guys, and you're neither white nor
Hey.
guy, and and so so
Yes,
I
that's
want,
true.
no, but so I want you to, can you explain a little bit more about the, how you're not welcome, or how you are made to feel unwelcome in the rooms where these conversations about uh, uh, creating the manifestos, or where the movement should go, or where we should devote our efforts over the course of the next several years. Uh, why isn't a voice like yours, or why isn't a voice coming from someone like you, unwelcome, or why do you feel unwelcome participating in those conversations?
Yeah, and I want to walk this line very carefully because I think these are people that I love and respect truly. I consider humanists, atheists, free thinkers, kin. I think we are all really striving to challenge some really problematic beliefs in society. So I don't want to, because unfortunately, my members of our community have been accused of this idea of being a victim, given all of the privileges that I do have. I want to say that, uh, nothing is going to deter me from participating in these conversations. Sometimes it can get a little uncomfortable. So let's dig into it a little bit, Leslie. I think people are generally reticent to hear an alternative perspective, one that challenges their own worldview. So, in order to acknowledge things like misogyny, you have to reconcile with some really uncomfortable parts of who you are, what you believe, and how you show up in the world. So, exactly those kinds of views that you had shared a little earlier around trying to find a scientific basis for why men are better, men are stronger, men are smarter, men are more virile, men are more capable, etc., etc. Um, Having somebody come in and be a very embodied version of challenging all of those things, being able to go toe to toe in an intellectual conversation on a myriad of topics can be really unsettling. And I think often that unsettling will lead to people saying things like, well, um, why do you want to be an academic, or why do you read so much, or why are you so ambitious, when you could go be a model, or you could do this, or you could somehow, belittling and fetishizing my entire existence with, um, just a few words. And unfortunately, I've presented at humanist fora, and I've delivered what I thought were very compelling remarks. And I've heard from most members of the audience that they were very compelling remarks. And I've had people afterwards come up to me and say, "Oh my God, you're so beautiful." So, I mean, obviously, that is not inherently misogyny, but there is a layer of sexism, and there is a layer of sort of social expectations or socialization around who I should be, what spaces I should be in, and where it's okay for me to share my voice. And I think not just for white men, but also for racialized men, and also just generally for people in positions of power. It can be very uncomfortable when someone is saying, actually, in principle, we have the same worldview, but I experience my lived reality very differently. And the way that you are articulating our modern declarations or other things is not sufficient in capturing my experiences.
Yeah, I can certainly see that if you're giving an academic topic or a compelling topic on whatever it is, but like on humanistic principles or history, and it's a good and interesting talk, and then the first feedback you get is on your physical appearance. That's uh, inherently devaluing the content of your presentation, uh, because that's I mean I'm sure that you like I do whenever I have given presentations, I dress up, I shave, I try and make myself look presentable, but that's not the people aren't there to look at me. God, that would be a horrible. I wouldn't want to subject people to that. So I can understand that. Now, on the course of what you just said, though, you kind of merged a number of things. You were talking about society and academia and humanistic circles more broadly, and uh, I will certainly acknowledge that. As I said before, that a certain type of sexism is still a large component of our society, and
Mm-hmm.
as humanists, we might not agree with it, and we might try and and work against it, but by no means are we immune to just the prevailing assumptions of the culture that we live in.
And
Have you?
I want to specify, sorry,
Mhm.
Leslie, to interrupt, but I want to specify that where I find particularly that it can become dangerous in the context of humanism
Hmm.
is you have some very, very well educated folks. You have some folks that have a very strong understanding of biology, chemistry, anatomy, etc. But that doesn't necessarily make them experts on the human condition. And I think anthropologists, time and again, have shown that there are different reasons for you know, men being physically larger on average than women. And these are not necessarily sort of inherent to the human experience. These are a result of perhaps, you know, malnutrition or other things that have been systematically experienced and have brought us to where we are in terms of the evolutionary path. And I think the other thing that we're discovering more and more, especially in the context of sexual and reproductive health, is that there is a lot of scientists who have sort of pinned notions of sexuality onto what they see from a biological or within a biological context. So what I mean by that, for example, is that there's often this story of how an embryo is formed. So you have an egg, and you have this powerful sperm that is flying towards the egg. But that is not actually, as we've discovered, the way that these processes happen. So even within what we understand to be a rational, scientific, biological understanding of things like sexual and reproductive health, we're going back and reevaluating those things and understanding, well, actually, perhaps the egg is a more, active player in the selection of the sperm. It's not just a passive waiter of this
Right.
strong, manly sperm that is coming to attack it. And I think these are narratives that unfortunately are embedded within the ways that we use science. And that's where the link to humanism is really explicit to me, because we rely so much as a community on scientific knowledge that I think sometimes we forget that part of scientific knowledge is being able to revise your point of view with the latest information evidence.
Right. And so the question I was going to ask is, you kind of just addressed. I wanted to know uh, how much of what you've experienced is part of humanism or within humanistic circles versus broader academia or broader society. I remember uh, seeing in a documentary where you have the ovum, and it's surrounded by dozens or
Mhm.
hundreds of sperm, and then one gets in, and that's where the
Right.
fertilization happens. Now, like, the video is taken. I don't think we can really argue that's how it happens, but you can describe it either as with you've got the hundreds of sperm each trying to get through, and then one finally penetrates the egg's defenses and
The
gets through to
strongest,
fertilization.
smartest one.
And you can watch the same. Yeah, that's right, right. And it's clever enough or strong enough or however it happens, and
Yeah.
one of the sperm gets through it. But you can watch the same video and say, so the egg has hundreds of suitors, all of which are vying to get in, and evaluating which sperm it thinks is best, and then it opens the door or allows one to get through, and that's when fertilization happens. And they're um, both of those explanations are perfectly consistent with the video with what we see, but it really puts the locus of agency, who is choosing or who is making things happen, very differently. It's either the different sperm in competition or the egg that selects which of the various sperm vying to fertilize is permitted to do so.
Yeah.
And I would hope that we would be willing as humanists to reevaluate not necessarily the facts, although yes, the facts when warranted, but not when unwarranted. But even taking what we know as facts, to reevaluate the stories that we tell from that factual foundation, because that can lead to different insights, different understandings, and therefore different practices. And just because it's new doesn't mean it's better, but that's why we need to have the conversation and
Absolutely.
evaluate and
Absolutely.
then proceed on that basis. But
And I'm
that
not
that
someone
takes
who
And like
It,
even putting, oh, sorry, just one more point.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Like even putting the human tendencies
Mhm.
to cling to. No, I've thought about things. I'm middle aged. I've for decades thought about things. I don't want to change how I think because that means I've been wrong all this time. Even putting aside that ego driven and psychological tendency aside, as
Mhm.
real as it is, that takes a lot of effort to get down to sort of some foundational narrative, some foundational stories. Take a look at the facts. How much of what we say is based on the facts, and how much of it was an extension and what we interpolated, and then evaluating different narratives around an agreed factual foundation, and then determining which of these competing stories is more accurate. That is an labor or intellectually intensive undertaking. And at some point, we just have to. I can understand a hesitancy to go over the same material again and again and again,
Mhm.
as important and as valuable as it might be. And I can see a tension there between wanting to move forward and revising some foundational uh, beliefs.
Yeah, and I'm not one to gamble, but I would say the vast majority of folks that I've interacted with within, the humanist community, but then also broadly in society, would really struggle with reevaluating that kind of very foundational, quote unquote, scientific belief or story or principle that they hold. And so I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, it's intellectually rigorous, it is difficult, and I think most importantly, as someone who is a humanist chaplain, it is emotionally exhausting, right? It's emotionally exhausting for people to fundamentally feel like the core values that they hold are being challenged. Nonetheless, and perhaps even exactly for that reason, it's important that we challenge some of these things. So that would be sort of one of my guiding principles is this idea of intellectual independence, and it's extremely uncomfortable in humanist circles because there are there is even a tendency within our community for groupthink, unfortunately. And it's very uncomfortable to put your hand up, to be visibly different from the vast majority of folks in the room and, you know, touch something that it just creates this very reverberating stirring in people. And I try my best to do that in a respectful, collegial, for the greater good way. But that doesn't mean everybody likes it. And, you know, not everybody enjoys that. And then there are the people who take it a bit too far and, start to lash out and say mean things and, the general, poor behavior that occurs. So, unfortunately, humanists and again, atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, those in our community are
Mm-hmm.
not immune to those kinds of patterns of behaving. And I think, coming back to what I was saying is historically, I don't think we've asked the question is who is sitting at the table influencing these documents? Whose voice is actually being heard? What is it that we're endorsing as a community? And I think if we look, for example, in the East, there are activist women who are non believers who nobody knows the name of, you know? Um, Similarly, in North America, I think maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, we could think of a few more, but similarly, it's very rare that they are the ones celebrated. And I think our organizations, if we were to look at who has been part of the leadership teams, who has been the president, it's not often folks of a different demographic. So I think it's uncomfortable, and I think it's important that we're having this conversation. And I think the most important thing is that we can actually use some of our shared values, just like you and I are doing as part of this conversation, which is, I think we both have a commitment to the betterment of humanity. We both have, some strong values and ethics principles that we share. and using those as a bridge to say, well, would you be willing to reconsider this? Would you be willing to examine this? Would you be willing to have this go through, an assessment by folks that are racialized, that are female bodied, that are, um, trans or other diverse gender, sexual minority communities? Would you be willing to have a different lens on it? And then ultimately, it's for members of our community to decide at what point they're willing.
Yeah, I think that even the Center for Inquiry Canada, we've been around for a little over 15 years as an
Mhm.
organization. And earlier this year, we elected our first female president. So, who's great. But for the first, I guess, 15 decade and a half plus of our existence, our leaders were, or at least the ones in the top position, have been men, and I think our vice president has been a woman for a long time.
Mhm.
But it's a fair point that those that are most prominent and in the highest leadership roles have had a tendency to be men. I think that's true generally, and includes, and is not unique to humanist circles and organizations, but we're not, or have not really been distinguishing ourselves in that respect either.
No, we haven't. For folks who are so keen to underscore human dignity and to underscore equality, um, I don't think we've gone far enough as an organized um, movement to really challenge some of those things. But I can say confidently that things are changing and that people are becoming more cognizant. And I think as we think about how to create welcoming spaces and how to create spaces where you can have healthy discomfort, rather than sort of the mean, nasty harassment type things that sometimes humanist conversations can go down that path,
they
unfortunately,
can, they
of
have.
name calling. They have,
Mhm.
unfortunately. Instead of going down that path, I think there is room for us to create spaces and create more welcoming spaces. I think it just
Well,
requires commitment.
that's actually one of the foundational reasons why we started the podcast for Inquiry, is to have what I hope are challenging, interesting conversations with on difficult topics. I've One of our third and fourth episodes of the podcast were on Quebec's Bill 21,
Mm.
which bans, among other things, bans civil servants, uh, including teachers, from wearing ostentatious religious garb. And according to the judge in the ruling, uh, 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 this rule, which can be said to apply equally to everybody, overwhelmingly falls on Muslim women. And I have never seen an issue uh, divide the secular community in Canada the way Bill 21 was. And what you were just saying about, well, what could be a principled debate devolve into name calling. Well, you're a racist. Well, you're a apologist. You're this and that, and the, the nastiness and the ad hominem attacks from people who really ought to know better was really quite disappointing to see. So our third and fourth episodes were conversations with a supporter of Bill 21, based on secular values and secular
Yes.
arguments,
Yeah.
and another interview with another woman who was steadfastly against Bill 21, considered it a
Mhm.
bad law. Again, based on secular and humanistic values. And I mean, I have my own opinions, and they came out because I was asked, and I respected that. I mean, I'm not. I try to explore both sides as openly and honestly as possible, but I have opinions. I have
Yes.
reached conclusions. I have thought about the arguments on both sides, and I have come to an opinion. But that I wasn't I did my best in the podcast to not to promulgate what I think is right so that all listeners would agree with me, but to get the best arguments in favor and against the bill out there so people can evaluate. And then when I was asked my opinion, I shared what it was and why. And I'm hoping that we can essentially lead by example to how we can have these difficult conversations on important and controversial topics. And listeners, let me know how I'm doing. We're a year and a bit in. Uh,
Well, I
so
think I think you're doing great, and I wouldn't have agreed to come on the podcast if I thought that you were going to yell at me the whole time.
no,
So I appreciate that, and I also appreciate, that there isn't necessarily an inherent denial of like, oh no, there's no such thing as misogyny. Oh no, there's no such thing as racism. Oh no, because unfortunately, once again, there are people in our community that hold those views. They don't fundamentally believe that these things happen. They don't
yeah,
believe that I experience sexual harassment. They don't believe that when I walk into a room that the people's way of interacting with me can be different, because perhaps in their minds the way that they treat me is not different. Perhaps they do treat me with the same respect that they would treat their, you know, whatever, non-female bodied, non-racialized colleagues. Um, However, that's not my universal experience, and so I do appreciate that there is an acknowledgement that having that experience and being able to put voice to it, that there is some value, because that is just the first step in a very long battle that we have ahead of ourselves.
yeah. Well, it is something, as I think I said this right at the start. It's not something that I can see, or at least not directly. I can certainly do my best not to treat you differently because you're a woman versus if you were saying the same things and you were a man. Uh, but when I first went online as a teenager, it was all text based, and I used my real name. So the number of people, most people, when they first interacted with me on bulletin board systems and then on the internet in Usenet groups, saw Leslie Rosenblood and assumed I was female.
Right.
And uh, I think as a mid teenager, when I got into an argument with somebody and my arguments were dismissed because it must be that time of the month, I look back and I'm going to admit to this, but I was pretty ignorant because I didn't know what they meant. I was like, do they
Right.
think I'm a werewolf? Time of the month? What? I figured that out, but that wasn't my initial reaction. But that's
I think that says more about our education system and our lack of dealing with substantive sexual and reproductive health
it,
issues,
it
which
does.
which is
I mean,
a
I had encountered. I mean, I knew what the menstrual cycle was. I wasn't a stranger to that, but that there was this broad societal assumption about PMS, and that anyone that's being irritable and argumentative and is a woman must be on the rag, which is the, the term that I heard a lot. Uh, it, I wasn't I wasn't exposed to that aspect, or at least it wasn't top of mind when I saw my arguments being dismissed as it being that time of month. So, but that's like fairly small and fairly minor, and then pictures became available and voice, and now there's really not a lot of ambiguity. So when somebody says that today people react differently when you walk into a room than when I walk into a room, I have to assume that you know what you're talking about your experience more than I do. And I'd like to know, like, what can we do? You're a prominent member of Humanist Canada. I sit on the board of another humanist organization, the Center for Inquiry Canada. Uh, One of my goals is, on average, to have half of our guests to be women on Podcast for Inquiry. We're not quite there. We're getting closer, and that's good. But we are. There's still been more men than women on the show. Uh, what would you like to see? What can we do? Like, what can you do within Humanist Canada? What can I do within the Centre for Inquiry Canada for institutional, I don't know, changes, programs, services, uh, policies that can actually help
Yeah,
beyond
absolutely.
platitudes. I mean, I can spout all the right platitudes, but I'm interested in what we can do, and we're both people with some degree of influence, not absolute power, but some degree of influence within our respective organizations.
Yeah.
And how can we put that to best use?
So I think that is really important. And I think there are so many strategies that are out there that I don't want to reinvent the wheel, but I can share sort of the things that I focus on. I would say that
Sure.
there's sort of three key principles. So the first principle is really about challenging the status quo. The second is looking for opportunities to organize, you know, collectively. And the third is then making really smart choices about who and where I donate, because I think, money talks in the world that we live in. So to share a little bit more, I think, first and foremost, even this conversation is challenging the status quo, right? The fact that we're even labeling something like misogyny, the fact that we're even relating it to something that is otherwise, um, based on this idea of human dignity, I think that is first and foremost exactly what we need to continue to do, Leslie, is we need to look for opportunities to say, okay, well, this is how we've been thinking about this issue. This is how we've been talking about this issue. This is how we've been talking about the origin story of humanism, for example. But let's step back and challenge that. Does that make sense? Is that an evidence-based belief? Um, and I think, call upon folks like me or others who are chaplains, who are sensitive to the needs of our community, who are sensitive to the needs of the human condition as we kind of debate through what I call the 4 E's of existential, ethical, emotional, and equity issues. As we go through that path, I think you need folks who are committed to making it safe, inclusive, diverse, welcoming, all of the things that perhaps we haven't emphasized as much as we could. So challenging the status quo is really the first part. Secondly, I think looking for opportunities to organize collectively is really important. So where there are issues where humanists can take a stand, so whether that is on sexual and reproductive health issues like abortion, like sexual and reproductive health education in primary and secondary schools, whether that is same-sex marriage, although I don't love that nomenclature, um, whether it is on gender diverse or minority sort of rights. These are places that I think humanists can really walk the
Yeah,
talk
and I
where
think that's. I mean, I've yet to meet uh, uh, anyone in the humanist circles who are against equal marriage, who are against a woman's choice to
I wish I could say that. I wish I
really.
could.
Okay,
Yeah,
well, that you've had different
unfortunately.
conversations than me, which is, I mean, I guess to
I
be
have. I
expected.
mean, I've
That's
I've
disappointing.
it is very disappointing, and it's very disappointing when, as a young person, I left formalized religion and I really had to walk away from the belief systems of my family, and then to have this kind of idealized view of what humanism is and have it sort of crash with the reality of things around me. I mean, it was deeply, deeply crushing and um, really, led to some existential anguish on my part in terms of if these aren't my people, who are my people? So I think we really do need
Are
to
you
be
willing to
careful.
share a little bit more of what what happened there?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's been different remarks, but I was in a conversation about abortion, which is something that I talk about often, given my academic expertise is in sexual and reproductive health. And someone said to me, and they were part of a humanist, event that I was attending, that, abortion is morally reprehensible. Like you are killing a life, and we can spin it however we want in terms of bodily autonomy and blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, it is a human life, and it's morally reprehensible whatever hoops we jump as humanists to justify it. I mean, just thinking about it, the feelings come back because I was startled
Hmm.
um, at someone fundamentally believing that and
and
being a
and
member of
and
our
this
community.
was life begins at conception. So the moment that
Right,
the moment that that the sperm fertilizes the ova is
right,
a human
right.
life right there. That was
Yes. Yeah,
the
absolutely.
argument. Okay.
And again, it's about, these folks who are often leaving organized religion having views that they have been indoctrinated into, and sometimes it's very hard to let go of
Right.
those views, right?
So
So,
they may have left behind the belief in God, but a lot of the other ones
yes.
carry over.
Yes. And similarly, there have been other conversations where I've had people say to me, "Well, are we talking about real women or trans women?" Um, and these are avowed, prominent atheist humanists within our community, right? So these are things that are very, very concerning, and oftentimes in the moment will leave me speechless because it makes me realize just how much work we have to do in order to make sure that we bring everyone along. There are certainly voices and people who feel disenfranchised in our movement. And if you're listening, I want to make sure that you know that I am hearing you. I'm hearing the feeling of disenfranchisement. I'm hearing the sense that you are, being discarded because of your genitalia or because of skin color that you haven't necessarily picked. And, I guess I want to extend that to, I understand that those feelings are difficult. And I hope that we can nonetheless work in partnership for the greater human good.
Yeah. I would like to second that. I've spoken with a number of current and former volunteers from the Center for Inquiry Canada. We're all volunteers, and uh, I've had people say that they felt unwelcome as women to basically do anything but listen to and agree with some of the guys in the room, and it was not a reflection of humanistic principles, but these were individuals, like they were human beings who, uh, when it comes to the principles of secularism, the principles of free thought or atheism, were actually very, very good speakers. Very good. They believed that and could and defended them in good ways, and they treated women miserably, and it's unfortunate,
Yeah,
and it drove a number of really good people away from both the organization and, more troublingly, from the movement as a whole. And I want to salute you for staying with uh, Humanist Canada despite the challenges that you've experienced. And it's one of the reasons why I've stayed with the Center for Inquiry Canada, is that uh, if things are going to change for the better, it's only going to be through diligent effort. And if we can make just small improvements on a regular basis, then over the course of time, those turn into big improvements. That's my preferred approach. Is just make things a little bit better with every effort, and step by step, and then over the course of weeks or months or years, you've gone a long way, even if there hasn't been any big jumps. But
yeah,
I think that the work is important, and I think that it is ongoing. I think we have made significant improvements, but that's not to say that the work is done. We have a long way to go, and that's why I think that uh, groups like Humanist Canada and CFIC are important. and that it requires the continued efforts of people like you. So thank you for that. I was speaking just a few weeks ago, just a few episodes ago. We had Marie Claire Cadij on the show, and she's the first humanist chaplain within the Canadian Armed Forces,
Yes.
and
Wonderful
she
human that I'm lucky to know.
yeah, and she has enormous respect for you. She credited your efforts. I think uh, uh, she implied, although she didn't state explicitly, that she wouldn't have been able to get through the entire bureaucratic effort uh, to become the first humanist chaplain without your diligent support. So, thank you for that. You are making a difference, and I hope you continue to do so.
Thank you, Leslie. I certainly try, and I do want to acknowledge all of the amazing work that's happening at Humanist Canada, and I want to say that the problems that I'm talking about are not necessarily solely or exclusively anything to do with Humanist Canada. So I have been part of international humanist fora, and that's where certainly some of these things have happened as well. So I think, there
Yeah,
are so many different levels of governance, which I love about humanism, and so many different ways that we can get involved. And the work that we have to do domestically, I think, is different than the work that we have to do internationally. And I think it's similar to the work that Canada plays on the world stage, right? As a champion for human rights, as a champion for gender mainstreaming, as a champion for some of these things that Canada is doing kind of as a player on the world stage. Similarly, I think we can bring that flavor to things. The president of Humanist Canada often asks me to present things jointly so that we can show that unified, and exactly like you and I said, that role modeling of effective behavior. So I'm very grateful for all of the folks who have welcomed me and have been open to my perspectives, including you, Leslie.
well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that even on things like equal marriage, right? When Canada, one of the arguments against it, well, it was like nearly 15 years ago, when
Mhm.
Canada was considering making it legal, was that it would lead to the destruction of society. If everyone could just marry whoever they wanted of whichever sex, then it would be terrible, and that's why no one else in the world is doing it. And there's a reason for that. And then we did it anyway, and society did not collapse. And it meant that people could point to, and Canada was not the first, but it was one of the first countries to legalize equal marriage on a national basis. And then the argument that society would collapse, you could point to countries like Canada and say it basically had very little effect, except that a significant minority of people are leading much happier lives. That was, I'd say, the biggest impact of equal marriage recognition in the
Yeah.
legal sense. And
And it depends on your worldview, but I mean, so many beautiful things have come out of that, right? Like
absolutely, when
changes
people are
to
happier, and that's human thriving. And like, as a
yeah,
humanist, that's what we want to encourage. Is
yeah,
I view
absolutely.
my role, like the main motivating factor of my activism, is to create the conditions for human thriving, because what I like and what's important to me and what I need to thrive is probably different than you, because you're a different person. You have different needs, you have different desires. Things that make you happy are different than what make me happy, which
Yeah,
is fine. That's human diversity. But the conditions that would allow you to do what you want and need to do to really become your best self are similar to the conditions required for me to do that a certain level of minimal wealth, the protection of human rights, and the ability to choose and autonomy. And then we're going to make different choices with those options, but having those options are foundational, and that's
absolutely.
my motivation for the activism. And yes, out of those, by people allowing to live with their partners as a spouse, where before it was secret, is allows for, as you said, so much beauty and wonderful things to flow from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the latest Stats Can data is incredible when you look at the diversity of family formation in Canada and different ways of thinking about kinship and adoption. And I mean, I love it. I love it. It makes me so happy.
Well, it's been a fairly heavy topic, and we're both smiling and are happy. So I'd like to leave on a high note. Any last thoughts, Srishti?
So, yeah, a few. I wanted to thank everyone at Humanist Canada. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank CFIC, excuse me, for having me. I'm really, really grateful, and I'm really grateful for future opportunities to participate in these dialogues, Leslie. So, if anything ever comes up, don't hesitate to think of me. I wanted to also just suggest that there are some really good books for the nerdy readers like me out there.
Okay.
There's a great book called Down Girl by Kate Mann, and it talks all about misogyny and talks about interesting sort of intersections between misogyny and humanism. And it is humanism defined in a different way than I think most people in our community would think of it, but it's still a very interesting read. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else, Leslie. I wanted to read a little quote from there that I thought was really powerful. So I'm just going to
Sure.
read it as a last thought for
Sure.
listeners. So it goes, think of misogyny then as a law enforcement branch of a patriarchal order. This makes for a useful, if rough, contrast between misogyny and sexism. Whereas misogyny upholds the social norms of patriarchies by patrolling and policing them, sexism serves to justify these norms. So I thought that was really, really powerful. And I hope that as people can think about their own behavior going forward, they can think about what role they're playing in perpetuating and being part of this law enforcement branch of patriarchy.
All right. Srishti Hukku, thank you for being on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Thank you, Leslie.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your contribution supports our efforts to have rational and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.